I want to start with a story about myself too, one that I frequently get asked. There's a frequent question that I get asked. Where are you from? So this is a frequent question. A number of you here asked me, and that question is often asked in a kind way, kind of, oh, where are you? You have such a lovely accent. Where is that from? Sometimes it's asked in a way that translates to kind of, you're not from around here, are you? So I usually get that question asked in more rural areas, but there was a time I was in a diner actually in the Columbus area, and there was a waitress who was at the registrar, and she heard me talking with a friend, and she shouted that at me from about 30 feet away, kind of, where are you from? I'm like, whoa, you're a waitress, why are you asking me this question? And so this is something that's one of the challenging things about being in the United States, looking like I am kind of, white, male, and so on, kind of all the privilege. But once I open my mouth, the accent comes out and people are like, oh, wait, no, you're not matching your stereotype, right? And so my accent comes from this little country right here called the Republic of Moldova. And my parents took me from there when I was 10, so I was a kid, traveled to the United States and settled down in New York City. So that's kind of my background. That's where I'm from. And I was really glad that they took me away from there and that they settled down in New York City, and eventually I ended up here in Columbus in Ohio, teaching at Ohio State. When I say settled in New York City, there were a number of other immigrants like me who chose to drop their accents. They chose to say, hey, I want to fit in here, I want to drop my accent. I chose to retain my accent as a way of connecting to my cultural heritage, but that's kind of something I eventually ended up regretting because of research that I found when I was starting my PhD program about accents. And there's an actual really strong discrimination in the United States against people with foreign accents. It's kind of surprising once you learn about it. I see a number of heads nodding, probably people with foreign accents. So people with foreign accents are trusted much less. So even when they say accurate stuff, completely truthful things, they're trusted much less than people who don't have that foreign accent. And this is a hidden aspect of diversity. This is an implicit bias. Some of you here might not be trusting what I say as much without knowing it, if you're not aware that this is a hidden bias that we all experience. So this is a challenging hidden bias that we all experience, and there's many other hidden biases that are pervasive in our culture. They are really strong and they are very challenging. So it's one of many of these biases. So they can be just as harmful in the workplace as more visible forms of biases. Now think about your workplace. We're all trying to have a more multicultural workplace. We're all trying to engage with society, which is growing more multicultural by the day, more and more people. So we want to hire people with diverse accents. We want to hire other people who have various aspects of multiculturalism, of diversity. But we may not be aware that there are these hidden biases which are challenging their ability to succeed in our company. And so when you want to think about these hidden biases, what kind of hidden biases might there be in your organization that might be challenging your success? How do you think you can address them in your diversity and inclusion efforts? And I want you to take about 30 seconds to write down your answer to this question. So there's a handout. There's a reason there's a handout. This is an educational part. So write down what kind of hidden biases do you think there might be in your organization? Ones that are not visible, ones that might be challenging for you in your diversity and inclusion efforts, especially from the multiculturalism perspective. So I'm really passionate about addressing these hidden biases, not only because I suffer from discrimination due to my accent, but because these hidden biases, at one point in my life, they almost cost me my business and my marriage. So this is something I'm really passionate about. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. First, we'll talk about what the presentation will be about as a whole. So just giving you an overview of what we'll be talking about. So we'll be talking about the role of social intelligence in diversity and inclusion. There will be some exercises, some Q&A. Then we'll talk about a specific strategy from social intelligence that you can use to address diversity inclusion challenges, have an exercise, and then we'll do a wrap-up. So that's going to be the essence of the presentation. You'll have 3 key takeaways. So think about these takeaways throughout the presentation. These are the 3 things. If you don't take away anything else, this is the things that you want to take away. Don't simply go with your gut. Don't. Bad idea. We'll talk about why in a bit. Watch out for cognitive biases. We'll talk about what they are. And use science-based decision-making strategies. So 3 things. These are the 3 things I want you to really be thinking about throughout the presentation and as you walk out of the room. So we'll start with an activity. I want you to take a minute to write down 1 opportunity and 1 challenge to your diversity and inclusion efforts. 1 opportunity, 1 challenge. They can be related or not related. We have some ideas about opportunities. We have some ideas about challenges. We have some ideas about the folks around us. Now let's go on. To understand the future of diversity and inclusion, we must go into the past, into our evolutionary heritage. Now, I want you to imagine something with me. Imagine your distant ancestors. Imagine you as one of your distant ancestors, kind of living in a tribe just like this one, a couple of dozen people around you, and you are sitting around the fire, sharing stories, sharing food, and suddenly there's a loud cry. Your outlook, your person who's watching out, observes an enemy tribe coming to attack your land. Very dangerous. You know, you're fighting for a tribe, for security, that's really important to you. So imagine that you're in that situation. The men go grab their weapons, run out to the entrance. The women grab the children, go deeper into the cave. This is the land of our ancestors. This is the tribal environment. We are all the children of people who grew up in these tribes. Tribalism was very important to survive. But tribalism is something that we all have inbuilt in us. So it's something that is just a part of who we are. Tribalism is a part of who we are. It's natural. It's human intuition. It's our gut reaction. So this goes, don't go with your gut. Our gut is to be tribal. Our gut is to like people like us, hire people like us, give them higher scores, and so on. That's our gut. That's our intuition. So we have to understand that in the modern world, our tribal intuition, what let us succeed in that world, in the tribal world, that's what led us to succeed. It's really harming us right now. It's not a good adaptation for our world right now. It really impedes diversity and inclusion initiatives. So our natural intuitions impede diversity and inclusion initiatives. I'll give you another example. So we had very nice lunch and very nice desserts. Sugar, eating sugar is another natural intuition that we all have. In the tribal environment, it was very important, whenever you had sugar, to eat as much of it as possible. So we are wired to eat sugar. That's bad in the modern world. No, don't do that. Don't eat all the sugar that's possible. You had a buffet there. Bad. Now, that leads to poor health for us if we eat as much sugar as possible. For physical health, for mental health. So we need to not be natural. We need to be civilized. We need to not eat all the sugar. Similarly, in our workplace, the natural thing is to hire people like us. The natural thing is to appraise people like us better. Diversity and inclusion is not natural. It's civilized, but it's not natural. We have to always understand that. In diversity and inclusion, we're always fighting against human intuition. We're always fighting against our natural intuitive reactions. So that's what we're struggling with. Human, natural, intuitive intuitions when we pursue diversity and inclusion efforts. Now, that's something that's a challenge, obviously, if we're going to be struggling against natural human intuitions. But it's also an opportunity, because now if we understand where the challenge is coming from, we've all had some more or less success with addressing the desire to eat as much sugar as possible, right? More or less. You know, the cheesecake is my Achilles heel. So we all have struggles, right? So we can also do the same thing with diversity inclusion efforts. What we need to do is understand what diversity inclusion efforts are struggling against and how to address these basic emotional intuitions. So one of the challenges that often accompanies diversity inclusion is shame and guilt. People often try to use shame and guilt to promote diversity inclusion. You know, and that's really, research is not bearing that out. It's showing that shame and guilt are just not going to help you in the long term if you pursue diversity inclusion efforts. Now, if you're fat shaming a fat person, that's really not going to help that person in the long term improve their eating. In the same way, shame and guilt in the long term will not improve diversity inclusion efforts. So those are not really good strategies. We need to use appropriate strategies, strategies that are informed by what we know about how the human mind works and how to influence people to get what we want. So let's talk a little bit about how our mind works, since that's what we want to do. How does our mind work? Now, we tend to think that we're this guy, this logical, rational brain. We're not. We're more like this guy. This is our brain. It's about 10% of 10 to 20% of our motivations. The large majority of our motivations are emotional. We are driven by our emotional. That's what our drivers are. Our gut reactions are intuitions. So we have to understand that. And we have to integrate that into our diversity inclusion efforts. If we are driven by our emotions, this is called system 1, the autopilot system that drives us. It's subconscious, automatic, fast, very quick, very habitual. That's the gut reactions, that's the intuitions, that's the 80 to 90% of what we do. There is another system of thinking called system 2. That's the rider intentional system. It's conscious, mindful, effortful. It's much slower, it's much more effortful. It's hard, the way it's hard to resist eating that second piece of chocolate cake. So in the long term, in the short term, you can try to use shame and guilt to address these intuitions, but it won't work in the long term. So these are not good strategies. What you need to do is figure out how to use system 2, the rider system, the one that's on top of the elephant, to guide the elephant into a good direction. Now, at this point, I want you again to think about how in your organization can you use this framework of thinking to address D&I efforts. How would it change your D&I efforts once you integrate this new understanding? And so take about 30 seconds to write that down. So let's go on to the next part. Now, we talked about system 1 and system 2. So system 2 of thinking is the intentional system, the logical system. There are a series of systematic thinking errors that research shows inhibit our ability to make good decisions. And these are called cognitive biases. So that's what we talk about when we talk about cognitive biases. There's a series of them. The nice thing about them is that we can predict them. There's over 100 cognitive biases currently discovered, and more discovered every day, well, every month. You can check out the list of cognitive biases on Wikipedia if you're interested. I would recommend that you check that out. So there's a huge list of them. And these are things that really inhibit our diversity inclusion efforts, as well as other thinking patterns that are healthy for organizations. So I'll talk a little bit about emotional intelligence versus social intelligence, something I talked to a number of people about here at the tables, and so I want to clarify how emotional intelligence and social intelligence will help you address these cognitive biases, these tribal instincts, these intuitions. So emotional intelligence is a concept that many of you might be familiar with. It has to do with self-understanding. Self-understanding, understanding your emotions, and being able to manage your emotions. So that's the two things that emotional intelligence is about. It's about yourself. Social intelligence is a little bit distinct. It's about other people. It's about understanding other people and your relationships with them and their relationships with each other. On a surface level, on a deep level, that's social intelligence. That's the first part of social intelligence. The second part of social intelligence is being able to influence them. Influence their emotions, influence their relationships. So that's something I talked about earlier. How do you influence these gut intuitions, these tribal instincts, to channel them into more healthy directions, ones that are going to be healthy for your organizational culture, unlike the second piece of chocolate cake. Social intelligent organizations. That's a concept, that's a term that's used for organizations that integrate the research on social intelligence into their policy and practices. So that's what a socially intelligent organization is like. Unfortunately, there are very few organizations that are actually deeply socially intelligent, that actually deeply integrate the research on this topic into their everyday practices and policies. Unfortunately, very many organizations underestimate the importance of emotions. They have an empathy gap. Empathy gap is a term that refers to people not being able to understand the depth of emotions in other people and how other people are motivated by emotions. The typical perception in organizations is, hey, I'm paying this person and I don't have to care about what they feel, right? That's kind of the typical perception. Unfortunately, not the case. We are driven by our emotions. You remember that the elephant is about 80 to 90% of who we are. The autopilot system is about 80 to 90% of who we are. The rider, the intentional system, is only about 10 to 20% of who we are. So the empathy gap is really dangerous. I'll give you an example. So I went to consult for a company here in Columbus that allowed me to talk about them as my clients. So otherwise I won't name my clients. It's Edison Welding Institute. And so when I went to talk to them, it was a really interesting situation. They were trying to motivate engineers. They had about 150 engineers to do selling, to do marketing. And as you can imagine, engineers are not thrilled about doing marketing. They are really interested in doing their technical stuff, right? So these people, the HR staff is trying to motivate them to do marketing, and it's just not working. They're giving them training, they're doing all these things, talking to them about the importance of it for the organization, not working. They're not doing marketing. So this is a problem. So they brought me in to figure it out, and what I figured out was this kind of empathy gap, and I'm saying, hey, you're really not speaking to the emotional needs of your employers. And the HR manager, Mark Madsen, who's still there, the HR VP, said, what, engineers have emotions? And I'm like, yes. They may not show it. That's not how engineers display themselves, but they're very emotionally motivated. And so what we did was we looked at what is actually motivating for engineers. And what we found was motivating was reputation among their peers in the organization and outside the organization. So we changed the language in which the company was communicating to them from kind of building up a personal brand, which just wasn't resonating with the engineers, to talk about being a thought leader and getting respect among your peers. And that simple language shift really made a sea of change, right? Really made a deep difference in the way that engineers were motivated. From a simple language change, from a simple way changing that you use the language to speak to engineers. And they were much more motivated and engaged with the process of marketing, just from that. So this is obviously relevant to D&I. Unfortunately, many people in positions of privilege and various categories of diversity have a deep empathy gap to people who are not in positions of privilege. It's a really big problem. The empathy gap is one of the fundamental challenges with diversity and inclusion. This lack of understanding, this lack of appreciation of the challenge that minorities experience on various scales of diversity from people in positions of privilege, whether it's people, so I have a non-US accent, and people who are in positions of privilege have a US accent. There's an empathy gap there. I'm a person who suffers from mental illness and anxiety disorder. There's an empathy gap there. other people have, who are in other positions of minority and privilege. There's all an empathy gap there. So what I want you to think about is, and write down, is where might the empathy gap be manifesting in your organization? And how can you potentially address the empathy gap in your organization? So again, 30 seconds to write that down. So this is a behavioral exercise borrowed from cognitive behavioral therapy, research-based behavioral therapy, that actually we have research showing that when you engage in exercises like this one, you build up empathy. They feel not comfortable to do, obviously, as many of you found. They're not a comfortable thing. Because at work, in professional settings, in this professional setting, right, we usually are not used to thinking about people as human beings. We're used to thinking about people as masks, kind of, this formal presentation. But people are human beings. They're driven mainly by their emotions. This sort of exercise helps break through that sort of barrier. And even though you might not feel it intuitively when you do it, you're actually building up an emotional connection to the person. You're building up an emotional connection to the person. You have more of a sense of caring for that person after you do this sort of exercise. And it's a relatively easy exercise to do. So I gave it to you without much preparation here. If you can integrate it pretty easily into your organization if you give a little bit of preparation to your staff, kind of this sort of exercise. If you do it, it's quite a bit harder to have team conflicts afterward. So it's a good exercise to do at the beginning of a meeting. Good exercise to do at the beginning of a meeting. It's also a good exercise to do to address diversity and inclusion issues, of course. What you'll want to do in that case is partner people on different aspects on different spectrum of diversity and inclusion. So someone in a position of privilege with someone in a position of minority, in order to adapt this exercise well to diversity and inclusion efforts. So this is an easy exercise that you can use to address the empathy gap. All right, so another question. What do you see here? How many people, just raise your hand, how many people see an old woman? Put your head down. How many people see a young woman? Oh, look, about half and half. So this is a deliberately ambiguous painting. As you can see, this is the painting that I showed before. This is the painting made up to look much more like a young woman. This is a painting, the same version, made up to look much more like an old woman. And this relates to one of the other biases that we all have, that people tend to have, the pessimism and the optimism bias. So the optimism bias is an unrealistically positive evaluation of reality. If you saw the young woman, you probably tend to be optimistic. If you saw the old woman, you tend to be pessimistic. Now this is the bias that almost cost me my business and my marriage. So my wife and I were married in 2003, and we never had a time in our marriage it was as difficult as in 2014, in spring 2014, when she and I joined to work on my speaking and consulting business. So we had a lot of fights, like really lots of fights, lots of conflicts, and we weren't really understanding what was going on, why we had so many fights and conflicts, until we started looking at these cognitive biases. And we discovered that what happens is that she's very pessimistic and I'm pretty optimistic. And so, she is very risk averse. She doesn't like to take risks. She thinks all new ideas are bad. I think all new ideas are good and I'm risk blind. So I think the grass is green on the other side. She thinks the grass is yellow on the other side. That's kind of the pattern that we had. And we had a lot of conflicts because of this. Now, once we realized that this was going on, we addressed it pretty quickly, and now we are much better in our collaboration. And I'll describe how from an example that I used in a local nonprofit that was having this same problem. It was a mid-sized nonprofit, I think about 50 employees, and they had a lot of team conflict. So it wasn't really a toxic culture, but they had a lot of team conflict when there were kind of people in the room. And because when I went in to figure out what was going on, it was the main driver was optimism and pessimism. So about half the people were more optimistic, half the people were more pessimistic. So the optimistic people, and you might recognize yourself or recognize some of your colleagues, they kept generating lots and lots of ideas. Really lots of ideas, tons of ideas. And the pessimists tended to just shoot those ideas down. So that's kind of the dynamic that was going on. Not helpful, just not a good dynamic when people are generating lots of ideas. The optimists, they thought that the pessimists were just naysayers. The pessimists were thinking that the optimists just went off half-cocked. That was the idea. That was kind of the dynamic that was going on there. Each was modeling the other person as themselves. The pessimists would never give an idea until they thought through all aspects of it and all the things that can go wrong until the idea was super perfect. And they were like, and when the optimists were coming up with ideas that weren't super perfect, the pessimists were saying, well, what are you doing? You're dumb. Why? That idea is dumb. That's just not good. A much more effective way to work together, and what we worked on in that nonprofit, is for optimists to generate the ideas, lots of ideas, 20, 30 ideas, whatever, and then let them go. So the optimists would let go of these ideas. And then the pessimists, they wouldn't criticize the ideas. They would just pick several of the ideas that were generated and work on improving them further. That took care of a lot of naysaying, kind of, oh, these ideas don't work. We're not talking about those ideas that don't work. We're just focused on ideas that do work and improve them. So basically, the optimists were coming up with half-baked half-baked ideas, and the pessimists were, baking them until the end, choosing a few that worked and baking until the end. That was a really good strategy for that nonprofit. And this is a typical hidden bias that tends to undercut a lot of teamwork and that you should be thinking about in your diversity and inclusion efforts. Cognitive diversity, not something we talk about. This bias, not really picked up on Myers-Briggs or DISC or standard profile, personality profile assessments, yet it's fundamental in causing a lot of team conflict in organizations. So I want you to write down any ways that you think optimism and pessimism might be manifesting in your organization as a problem and how you can address it. Let's go on to another cognitive bias that you really want to watch out for. This is one that really causes a lot of problems in diversity and inclusion initiatives. It's called the halo effect and the horns effect. The halo effect and the horns effect. This is tribalism at its strongest. So, as you know, I'm a professor at Ohio State. I'm contractually obligated to root for the Buckeyes. I'm guessing there are a lot of Buckeyes fans here, Go Bucks, right? Yo, there you go. Now, how likely are you to hire a Michigan fan? See, 3 people. Now, regardless of how we feel about Michigan fans and their poor choices, in which team to root for, does that indicate anything about their performance as an employee? No, I know. Come on, that no should be stronger. Right. So this is a typical problem that we run into, the halo effect and the horns effect. The Buckeyes, that's a tribe. That's a tribal affiliation. Whether you went to Ohio State or just rooting for the Buckeyes, that's a tribal affiliation. You recognize yourself in other people who root for the same team. There's a lot of passion, a lot of emotional engagement. And there are plenty of people who I talked to who said they would never hire a Michigan fan. This works for any other dimension. But that's a really, really not good thing for diversity and inclusion from perspective of hiring the best employee possible. So the halo effect, this one. If we like one characteristic of an individual, we'll tend to like all of their other characteristics. That means we'll be more likely to hire a Buckeye fan. Everything else, being equal, regardless of how rational that might be from the perspective of the workplace. The horns effect is the opposite. If we don't like one characteristic of someone, if they, for some reason, root for Michigan, we're not going to like all other aspects of them. We're going to have decreased evaluations of them. Very tribal, very big problem. The halo and horns effect for sports teams, translates to race, gender, age, disability, everything else. Accents, mental illness, all sorts of things. So, and this is a big problem in hiring, and it goes both ways. So there was a clothing chain store with about 4,000 employees in New York that brought me on to figure out why their diversity inclusion hiring efforts weren't working out. The manager of the chain was really concerned that her team was not her sales team wasn't really able to engage with customers well, with the multicultural customers, because they didn't have a sales team that was diverse enough. And she was really incentivizing diversity hires, so that was going on. So that was good, and so kind of I looked at that was good. And so they were taking care of the horns effect of addressing the diversity, kind of not wanting to hire people who are like you. Now what was going on is something that the person in the back mentioned. The problem that they weren't addressing was the halo effect, hiring people who are like you. So that's something that they weren't really addressing. And what we talked about and what we worked out, there's a very easy strategy to address that, and that's disincentivizing people who are like you. So in your employee assessment questionnaire, evaluating whether somebody is like you, whether they're a Buckeye fan, whether they went from the same place, were they born in the same place, do they come from the same cultural background, socioeconomic background, and giving them negative points for it. So disincentivizing hires that are like you, that are like the people doing the interview. Very effective strategy, and that's what helped turn around the situation for the clothing chain store. And that's a relatively easy thing to employ in D&I settings. So not simply taking care of both the horns effect and the halo effect. Now I want you to write down how you can address that in your organization. Where might the halo and horns effect be manifesting? 30 seconds. And how you can address the halo and horns effect. All right, let's go on to addressing cognitive biases. So that's the next topic. What are the keys to dealing with cognitive biases in diversity, inclusion, and more broadly? So I'm not going to have too much time to go into it. If this was a half-day presentation, I'd give a number of strategies. Now we'll be limited to one specific strategies that I think is most relevant to diversity and inclusion efforts. So we'll talk first about what you can do. That's learning about cognitive biases, obviously, for yourself, and addressing any cognitive biases that you experience. Then integrating knowledge into your organization about cognitive biases, bringing that knowledge into your organization, and then using science-based decision-making strategies. So we'll talk only about one decision-making strategy. That's the time that we have today. Putting a number on things, and I really appreciate you bringing that up, is a really very effective way of addressing cognitive biases. Why is that? It taps into our intentional system, the system 2, the system that's not the autopilot system. So our logical, rational thinking system. The autopilot, the emotions, they don't really do numbers. They do yes, no, fight, flight, like, dislike. The numbers really help us bring out the logical, rational part of ourselves, and that's what helps us bring out the civilized part, not the natural, savage part, the civilized part of us. So putting numbers on things. So this also facilitates transparency. That's really important. So there's a lot of research showing that transparency and perceptions of justice, injustice is what determines employee engagement and employee buy-in into the decision making. So putting numbers on things and being transparent about that is really helpful. And of course, it brings to light potential challenges to diversity and inclusion because you actually have data. You don't go just on your intuition and gut reactions. You can actually have the data. As we talked about, kind of the assessment process. If you bring all the leaders together and you compare them, then you actually get the data on who assesses who and in what ways. Now, it's really important when you put numbers on it to communicate clearly to your stakeholders about why you're creating the numbers. As much as possible, get them involved in creating the numbers. That helps facilitate really good conversations and gets everyone on the same page. It's not kind of the numbers don't come down randomly out of somewhere. That's really important. So I'll talk about a web app, so I'll need to move over here. That really helps you make the right call on significant decisions. We'll take a hiring decision as an example. You have the web app notes in your handout, so you don't need to write out this URL. So, but keep that in mind. Somebody shouts something out. Why? What kind of things would you want to evaluate somebody on? Experience. What else? Education. What else? I'll put a more broader character instead of integrity. And since we're in diversity inclusion, we'll make sure to add diversity. Anything else? Culture fit, so fit. Factors. How important is experience? From 1 to 10. 10. Remember, not everything can be 10. Education. Just shout out a number. 5. Skills. 7. Character.
7.
Diversity. How important is that?
8.
Mm-hmm. And fit?
8.
Great. And then options. Let's say Jane, Jack, Jill. And then you simply rank them. So all you have to do, all the decision-making team has to do is rank Jane, Jack, and Jill on these categories. Again, on a weight of 1 to 10. So let's say 5, 4, 8, 7, 5, 8, 8, 4, 3, 8, 5, 6, diversity 9. Again, random number generating here. And then you click on next. And there you go. So you have your scores. Very easy, very simple, very clear. You can have your team give input on each one. You can have each individual team member fill this out for each person, and then average the scores. Here you can go and check your gut. Does the answer feel aligned with your intuitions? It allows you to do a number of things. So the next step here is check for thinking errors. And you can talk about loss aversion, status quo bias, a bunch of other thinking errors. Confirmation bias, attentional bias, overconfidence, optimism bias, Hill effect, Horn's effect, and correct them as needed. And then you'll have the final step. It's a very easy, very quick tool that you can use. And so a lot of stuff that I do when I go into organizations is give training on how an organization can integrate this into their practices. So this is you don't have to simply use a tool. What I strongly recommend is that there's a conversation. If there's a disparity about people's rankings, you want to have a conversation about, hey, I'm curious to observe that you ranked this person at a 1 and this person ranked him at a 9. Why is that the disparity? What's going on there? And so the next step, the next step up of complexity is if there's a disparity, a strong disparity, you want to talk about why there's the disparity in your team. And that can bring out a lot of issues. So it's a very healthy conversation to have. And the nice thing is, you don't have to have any arguments, you don't have to have any fights, the numbers are out there. It brings a lot of transparency and clarity to things.
Yeah.
Yes?
Is your scoring 1 for 10? And
Yeah.
does it have to be 1 for 10?
It doesn't. It's just, I put it arbitrarily. It's a good practice to score it 1 for 10. You can also do 0, 1, 2, whatever we want to use, or 1 to 100. But 1 to 10, I find that most people prefer that. People are used to thinking in 1 to 10 numbers, but whatever the organization uses, 0 to 3 is a typical scoring system for organizations on assessments and processes. So that's another one you can use. The strategy of placing numbers on things. Yes, please.
So I've worked with performance management that has put numbers on things, and I can find plenty of examples where a hiring manager will or a supervisor
Yep.
So how can I make numbers work better for me in the performance management side of things?
Sure. So in the performance management, you can give people a limited amount of points that they're allowed to distribute. So that's a very typical answer, kind of, to these things. Just give people a limited amount of points, so you can only distribute these points. Getting to the 3 key takeaways. We're not quite there yet, but we're coming closer to the end. So don't go with your gut. Remember, our gut, our natural intuitions, are tribal. It's just where they are. People tell you to go with your gut. The diversity inclusion, this is not something you should go with your gut. If you're standing in the way of a moving bus, you should go with your gut. Now, the reason for that is that it matches the savanna environment. It's like the saber-toothed tiger response. Yes, that's a good fight or flight move. You don't want to go with your gut in diversity inclusion efforts, and in most cases in organizations, not a good idea to simply go with your gut. So it's really dangerous, and it can really hurt you. Watch out for cognitive biases. We talked about optimism bias and pessimism bias, something that almost cost me my business and my marriage, something that causes a lot of problems and conflicts in organizations. Talked about the halo and horns effect. It's a fundamental one that really impedes organizations in a lot of ways in diversity and inclusion, really harmful. And the empathy gap. People tend to greatly underestimate the importance of emotions in motivating their employees in engagement. So that's something to really watch out for. It causes a lot of problems in diversity and inclusion because people in positions of privilege underestimate the strength of emotions in people who are in marginalized positions. And of course, use science-based decision making. So we talked about putting numbers on it, the web app. There are plenty of other strategies. Didn't have time to go over here today. So I'm going to challenge all of you to invest your efforts in social intelligence-based strategies, understanding and influencing other people's emotions. That's what social intelligence is about. Understanding other people's emotions, relationships between them, understanding and being able to manage other people's emotions and the relationships between them. I think you should have gotten a lot of strategies here in understanding where other people are coming from and influencing their emotions. But remember also, shame and guilt, not a really good strategy in the long term. So you want to be able to induce people strategically to actually go where you want them to go. And that's where you can deploy social intelligence effectively. I'm going to challenge you to invest in the next month 10% of your organization's diversity and inclusion efforts into social intelligence-based strategies. 10%, not too much, but this is the start of a shift. And you've talked to each other about holding yourself accountable for implementing these things. And I want you to stick to that accountability, to hold each other accountable for taking the next steps to invest into social and emotional intelligence strategies. Next month after that, you can do 10% more and slowly increase. So integrate this knowledge into your organizations. This is going to be crucial for you to actually achieve social intelligence for diversity and inclusion success